Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Davis,
And I'm Lauren Papanos.
and today we're going to talk about the GLP-1 weight loss drugs. And we're going to talk about a few things about them because there's been a lot of talk about it. A lot of it's showing up in the news, and we wanted to make sure that all of our patients had a good understanding of, kind of the basics of how it works, what it proposes to do, what it can do, what it can't do, and then how we can approach it both in terms of its use and using it safely, and also considering some alternative options that we have for avoiding the use of medications and focusing on more healthy lifestyle choices. So first, just to go over it, we're going to talk a bit about what these medications are, how they are used, what effect they have on the body, what limitations they have, and then how they can be optimized for your health. So like I was saying, these medications called GLP-1 agonists have become famous. And these are the medications that people have been hearing about, like Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound. All of these are GLP-1 agonists. And they've been making a lot of news. People are calling it the end of obesity, basically treating it as a complete cure for any sort of weight issues. It's, a lot of famous celebrities have been coming out and talking about their use of this medication. And so it's very, very popular in the discussion, and it can be a useful tool in a physician's arsenal, but it has to be used responsibly for the right people with good awareness and understanding of what it can and can't do. So like I was saying, some of the well-known GLP-1 agonists are Ozempic and Wegovy. These are both the same medication. These are both semaglutide. There's also Zepbound and Mounjaro, which are also both tirzepatide, and other medications like Trulicity and Victoza and so forth. I thought it might be fun to start by talking about where we get these medications from. And it just real quick little diversion. It comes from this animal here called the Gila monster, or Gila monster, I believe. And they derive this from the toxin found in its saliva, and were able to find this medication. Just an interesting little anecdote. So before we get into exactly how these medications work, I think it's worth going over very briefly just a little bit of the science of what happens in our body without medications. How does it normally work? We have two hormones that play a big role in our blood sugar regulation, and they are insulin and glucagon. Insulin, we basically think of as a signal of our fed state. So when we eat food, insulin gets released, and that helps to signal our muscle and fat and liver tissues to take up glucose. It also tells our liver to stop producing glucose and putting it into our bloodstream. And it also suppresses the other hormone, which is glucagon. Oftentimes in patients who have diabetes, we become less sensitive to our naturally produced insulin. That other hormone there is glucagon, and that acts more frequently in our unfed or kind of starving state. It triggers the release of glucose from our stores, particularly in the liver, and also triggers the breakdown of fat cells and the production of ketones. So how do GLP-1s play into all of this? They work in a sort of a accessory pathway that stimulates insulin secretion. When we eat food, that food entering our stomach and our gut triggers the release of this hormone called GLP-1, and that then promotes the release of insulin, and then suppresses glucagon secretion. And when that GLP-1 is released, it also slows down our gut movement, slows down our stomach emptying, so we feel more full. It also sends signals to our brain that make us have a lower appetite. So it has a lot of effects. And in fact, it tends to have an even bigger effect on our insulin and glucagon secretion than even the sugar that enters our bloodstream. Okay, so that's just a very brief kind of scientific background on how these medications kind of work in our body. So again, just to summarize, it slows down stomach emptying, it lowers our appetite, and it increases our sensitivity to insulin, which can help with blood sugar control, which is why these medications initially were investigated as a diabetic medication. So why do people like to use GLP-1s? What have been the findings, and how are we kind of seeing it used in the modern day? The one that's making all the news is weight loss, right? Because of that decreased appetite, because of that slowed gastric emptying, patients eat less food and they feel less of a desire for food, and they also have better insulin sensitivity, which all helps to promote some degree of weight loss. Now, we'll get into some of the limitations of how much weight loss we expect to see, but there generally tends to be at least some amount of weight loss with this medication. Again, this was initially investigated as a diabetic medication, so we find that it helps with blood sugar control. For those of you who are familiar with diabetes, A1C, which is a very common measurement that we use for monitoring blood sugar, often gets reduced with this medication. That's a really big deal. That's really great. We've also found that it has some benefits for diabetics or other high-risk patients who have diabetes and weight issues and heart failure. And in those patients, they have a better exertional tolerance when they are taking the medication. They also have a reduced incidence of heart attacks and strokes while on the medication. These are all really, good things. That's why it's, been in the news and been such a big deal. But it does have certain limitations. So, for one, there is a high likelihood of regaining any weight that you've lost once you stop the medication. All of that, slow gastric emptying and appetite suppression and all of those aspects that, make it easier for patients to lose weight also get reverted back to their normal level once you stop taking the medication. And so when we stop it, we find that a lot of our patients regain most of the weight that they lost. We also see that there's variable degrees of success. We see people who go on the news and talk about, huge amounts of weight loss, and some patients do experience that. In the original studies, we found that about half of patients were losing about 15% of their body weight. But then later, as we've started to look deeper at observational studies in the real world, we find that it tends to be not quite so much. Only about 30% of patients in one study were able to lose even 5% of their weight at 1 year, and then that got up to 40% after 2 years of using the medication. And with that medication comes expense. A lot of patients are having to pay out of pocket for it, especially if they don't have a diagnosis of diabetes. It has almost everyone will experience gastrointestinal symptoms, the feeling of early satiety, possibly nausea, vomiting, possibly constipation or diarrhea. Some other limitations or risks with it include an increased risk of gallbladder disease like gallstones. We also find a process that we call sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass. When people lose muscle mass, lose weight, they often will lose muscle mass, and we find that tends to be the case. Now, in patients who have higher BMIs, who have a higher weight, the proportion of muscle mass lost is, pretty similar to the amount of fat loss, so it's not too much of an issue. But in patients who have a lower BMI, who maybe don't have as strong of an indication for this medication, they're more likely to lose more muscle than they do fat. And that would certainly not be a desirable thing because that comes with a lot of other long-term health manifestations. And then one last thing that's still being investigated, so I don't want to, call this an absolute thing, but there is an investigation for possible suicidal thoughts when using this medication. And this is just an example. I went on earlier today onto GoodRx and looked at how much it's costing currently for some of the common GLP-1 medications. And this is for a 1-month supply. And so that's the current estimated cost for out-of-pocket payment of these medications. So like I was saying, there is some serious benefits that we are seeing with the medication in the right patients, but that comes with different risks, different limitations. And I think that we want to emphasize that we can play a substantial role in helping you make decisions about that. You want to make sure that whoever is giving this medication understands your medical history, how it should be used for you, how it should be dosed, how we can manage your side effects and, make adjustments as needed, how we can discuss alternatives if you aren't finding the medication tolerable. And then additionally, relying upon our nutrition services to help either supplement or even possibly replace the use of these medications as part of a collaborative guided lifestyle change. And with that, I will hand it over to Lauren to discuss some of the changes that we can make in our lives to either supplement or even replace the need for these medications.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, and thank you for that overview. It was extremely helpful and thorough. And yes, as you mentioned, there's a lot that we can do. And as you saw the mechanisms of how these medications work, they're working primarily on a couple of different systems as it relates to our appetite hormones, our blood sugar control, and there's a lot of things that we can do within diet, lifestyle, supplementation to actually get a very similar effect as we're seeing. So I wanted to first and foremost start off and talk about, for those of you that might already be on one of these medications, what are some considerations so that you can really maximize the outcomes of being on them. And then once we talk about that, we'll get into what are some alternative, more natural solutions if you want to reap the benefits of a GLP-1 agonist without taking one. So first and foremost, as Dr. Davis mentioned, muscle loss tends to be a problematic concern for those, especially that have a lower BMI that are on one of these GLP-1 medications. And one of the things that we can do is we can supplement with adequate protein in our diet and make sure that we are also resistance training to help mitigate that muscle loss. Regardless if you are on a GLP-1 agonist or not, if you are in a caloric deficit, you are eating less calories than what your body needs because you are focused on weight loss. It's always a very good idea to be eating a higher protein intake. Your protein need does increase when you are on a when you are in a caloric deficit. Your protein need also increases as you get older because our body's naturally losing muscle mass every year, really after the age of 30. So Dr. Davis, you could just go back to the last slide. I just want to make sure I covered everything on there. Yeah, prioritizing protein intake. So we really should be aiming for about 30 grams of protein 4 times per day. I know that might sound like a lot to you, and that's because old guidelines of what was adequate protein intake have been substantially revised in the last few years. And we know that protein is actually a more important macronutrient than we once thought it was, not just for weight loss and muscle, but also for functions like our immune system, our bone mineral density. So when we're talking about weight loss, we want to make sure that we're not only eating enough protein throughout the day, but that we're also eating it very evenly spaced throughout the day, because our body doesn't have as efficient mechanisms for storing excess protein as it does the other macronutrients like carbohydrate and fat. So somewhere around 30 grams, which is about 4 to 5 ounces of any of your animal protein sources. Something that can also be a great consideration is creatine monohydrate. Again, this is another supplement that has gotten a lot of bad rap over the last, I would say not, I mean, a lot of the research in the last 10 years or so has been very positive, but maybe before then, you might have heard of creatine being more of like a bodybuilder type supplement. But there's actually been a lot of research done in older populations with creatine monohydrate and its ability to support cognition, help prevent cognitive decline, also help to be able to prevent sarcopenia by retaining lean muscle mass. And so this can be another great consideration that you can actually purchase as a supplement through our third-party supplement dispensary Fullscript and utilize every day as just a vitamin supplement in addition to your everyday protein intake. All right, the next consideration if you are on a GLP-1 is how to mitigate GI symptoms. Dr. Davis mentioned that this is a very common complaint for those that are on one of these medications, is that there can be a lot of GI issues. I would say most notably nausea being the most common. There's a couple of things that we know to be very helpful for nausea in the nutrition world. One of those where more of the research has been done with morning sickness in women during their first trimester of pregnancy is vitamin B6. This is a supplement, though, that you want to be very careful with, that you are not taking more than necessary of, as it can create other complications. And that's where working with one of your registered dietitians at PPMA can be very helpful to make sure that you're taking the right dose, but that can be a very valuable vitamin to be able to help with nausea. Also, protein is another helpful tool for nausea, and eating protein often throughout the day in more smaller meals has also been shown to help with nausea. And then you might be familiar with the use of ginger, and this can be done as a ginger tea, ginger capsules, pickled ginger throughout the day to be able to help curb that nausea as well. Constipation can also be common. As Dr. Davis mentioned, these drugs, they slow transit time, which means that food is moving through your stomach less quickly. And that might mean that you are not going to the bathroom as quickly as well. You're generally also not eating as much food volume. And when we don't eat as much, our gut doesn't have to process as much. And so there's less volume to eliminate. And so this is why constipation can develop. Of course, we want to make sure that we have the basics down, that we're eating enough vegetables so that we're getting enough fiber into your diet, that we're drinking adequate water, that we are getting in some physical exercise every day, as these are essential for our digestive system. But when those don't work, there are some other solutions that we have. This can include things like aloe vera juice, psyllium husk, which is generally sold as a powder, and then magnesium citrate, which is a specific form of magnesium. Aloe vera is a juice that you can purchase at the grocery store, not the aloe vera drinks that have a lot of added sugar. This is different. This is found in the supplement section, and it's generally sold as inner fillet is what you're looking for. We don't want whole leaf. We want inner fillet. And this is something you can do a couple ounces of 1 or 2 times per day to help with motility. Psyllium husk can also be great for helping bulk the stool as it's a soluble fiber. It's kind of similar to like if you eat a lot of beans, beans for some people can cause other problems, but they can help bulk the stool so that you have a more formed bowel movement. And you can purchase psyllium husk as a powder. We just want to make sure that we're purchasing 100% psyllium husk. I do not recommend brands of psyllium husk such as Metamucil because the psyllium husk is the active ingredient, but there's also a lot of preservatives and artificial sweeteners and things that are added to those. So we want to look for 100% psyllium husk. Magnesium citrate, generally you're looking for a couple 100 mg of this, around 400 mg, but this is something that we can, of course, personalize for your individual needs as well. And this is a specific type of magnesium where the citrate is bound to the magnesium. There's a lot of different types of magnesium that are on the market, but magnesium citrate tends to be more of a laxative and help with our digestive system. On the other end of things, if you are having diarrhea, which can sometimes also happen, not just with GLP-1s, but also with medications like metformin and such as well that are used for diabetes. First and foremost, if you're drinking a lot of caffeine, this is something to be mindful of, especially coffee. Caffeine has chlorinogenic acid in it, which increases motility and makes you stimulate the digestive system to go to the bathroom more. And so we might want to be mindful of caffeine and coffee in general, especially if you're noticing you're having diarrhea in the morning. We also want to make sure that we're eating enough of those soluble fibers as those help bulk up the stool. So psyllium husk is a great supplemental soluble fiber, but we can also get soluble fibers from foods that we eat. These are things like our legume family, beans, chickpeas, lentils, avocado, sweet potatoes, chia seeds, flax seeds. They all are very rich sources of soluble fiber and all contain a ton of phytonutrients and vitamins in them that are great for us as well. Saccharomyces boulardii is another type of option here. There's been quite a bit of research on Saccharomyces boulardii and traveler's diarrhea in particular, but it's a specific type of probiotic that is a yeast-based probiotic. It's a little bit different than some of your other like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium probiotics that are on the market, and it's really great for helping with diarrhea and loose stools as well. Okay, another common symptom that can happen with these medications because they do increase that insulin sensitivity and help with blood sugar control is that some individuals might experience the opposite effect where they're actually going hypoglycemic. And this could be because we might not be eating enough since their appetite is low, or it could also be because of the impact on insulin and blood sugar. So we want to make sure that we are trying to prevent getting into hangry situations. You've probably felt that before, where you feel very ravenous, you feel like you need to eat immediately, you feel kind of dizzy, you feel lightheaded, like you feel like you might gonna faint. These are all situations of hypoglycemia. And we want to try to prevent those because those create more instability in our blood sugar, where then our body super compensates to be able to get our blood sugar levels back up, releases stress hormones to be able to do so. And it can create a lot of problems. It can create a lot of sleep challenges as well. And this can happen to individuals a lot when they're sleeping. So it's really important that we're preventing these if we want to get good sound sleep, which is really important for weight loss. So we want to make sure that in order to prevent this, that we're eating very macronutriently balanced meals every few hours. This is going to make sure that we have the right balance of protein, fats, carbohydrates that are helping to be able to stabilize the blood sugar response to that meal, that are helping slow digestion, kind of working very similarly to how these medications do. But the reason why we don't want to necessarily just eat like a bowl of pasta by itself is because although eating carbs in the immediate when you're hypoglycemic may be very efficient for getting your blood sugar back up, they actually can create more rebound problems throughout the rest of the day. So we want to try to get ahead of these hypoglycemic episodes by making sure that we have a very stable blood sugar response to the meals that we're eating so that we can prevent ever having to get into a hypoglycemic type situation. Dehydration is another common symptom, and sometimes this can be reflected in your labs if you get those done when you are on one of these medications. But just making sure that you are drinking adequate electrolytes and fluids. We've seen some of the research that GLP-1s don't just decrease appetite, they also decrease thirst. So you might not be getting the right signals from your brain to even consume water. So you might need to be more mindful of having an alarm with you or on your phone, having a water bottle with you to make sure that you can stay on top of your fluid intake. It's also really important that, especially when you are losing weight quickly, that we also have enough electrolytes, because as we lose weight and our body depletes its glycogen reserves, we also lose water with that. And that's why you generally lose a lot of weight initially. And so we want to make sure that we are consuming adequate electrolytes, as those help mitigate some of the fatigue and dehydration symptoms that can happen, especially in the initial stages of weight loss. So electrolytes, generally people think of as supplements, but electrolytes are actually just specific minerals that we can eat through certain foods in our diet, things like magnesium, potassium, and sodium. We can also utilize unrefined salt type options like Celtic salts, Redmond's real salts, when we cook, to be able to provide some of these more natural sources of these electrolytes. And then we can also consume these electrolytes through our food through things like avocados and leafy greens and fish, seafood-based sources, because these provide these natural sources of electrolytes in them. And then if we need to, that's where we can turn to an electrolyte-based supplement. We've got several options inside of our full script vitamin dispensary as well, or we'd be happy to recommend one to you if you schedule a one-on-one appointment. And then finally, one of the things that we are seeing with GLP-1s is that there's also some research on activation of the nervous system. And this isn't 100% conclusive in terms of how that affects the body. But generally, when our nervous system gets activated, we release stress hormones like cortisol, you might have heard of before. And this can cause other downstream effects to things like our digestive health, even things like our hair growth, our nail growth, our ability to lose weight, sleep, all of these other factors, our immune system. So you might want to consider things like calming adaptogenic herbs. These are specific types of vitamins that you can purchase that help our body to be able to cope with the effects of an activated nervous system or high cortisol levels. And you might have heard of things like ashwagandha or holy basil before. We want to be very careful with where we're buying herbs, as they can be problematic in terms of the sourcing and quality of them. And so again, we have some options within our full script dispensary that we can recommend for you. But just really being mindful that if you are on any of these medications, that you also are taking time to de-stress and relax and, deep breathe, take deep breaths throughout the day so that we can really calm down that nervous system activation. Okay, so now you've seen all of the things that can, potential symptoms that can come up and how we can hopefully mitigate those with nutrition. Now let's talk about how we can use nutrition and lifestyle as a tool to actually get some of the benefits that GLP-1s can provide to things like our blood sugar and appetite and weight loss. So as I mentioned, and as Dr. Davis said, one of the ways that GLP-1s work is by improving blood sugar control. And we can actually do this through the way that we eat. And this just comes down to the way that we pair foods together and the certain ratios of macronutrients that we eat at a meal. So what we want to try to prevent is having any carbs by themselves. I call these naked carbs. So we want to make sure that anytime you eat something that has a substantial amount of carbohydrate, that it always has protein and fat paired with it. Protein and fat are what help to be able to slow down the release of sugar. They also help to be able to slow down the digestive process, and ultimately they're going to help slow down the blood sugar response to that meal. We talked about earlier the importance of protein, and protein, I cannot overemphasize the importance of it as it relates to not even just weight loss, but also improving blood sugar control, because it can help with insulin sensitivity, which is that hormone that Dr. Davis talked about being a really important component to GLP-1s. So we want to make sure that each time we're eating, whether it's a meal, it's a snack, there's protein, and that they never have carbohydrates by themselves. There's also some research on the role of consuming vinegar before meals, because the acetic acid, which is the active compound in vinegar, has been shown to be able to help lower the postprandial glucose response. So essentially how elevated your blood sugar goes after a meal. So what you can do is you can actually mix together a tablespoon or two of apple cider vinegar or white vinegar, Generally, apple cider vinegar is a little bit tastier. Consume that before you start eating your meal. And this is another great way to help lower that blood sugar response. Ceylon cinnamon, this has also been something, tons of research on its role in helping with blood sugar response as well to meals. You do want to make sure that you're purchasing the Ceylon variety of cinnamon. There's several types like cassia and such that don't have the same effect and that in large enough dosages can actually be toxins. So we want to make sure it's the Ceylon form. It is a little bit more expensive, a little bit harder to find, but it is something that you can source at the regular grocery store like Sprouts and so forth. We also want to make sure that we are regulating our appetite hormones. GLP-1, like Dr. Davis mentioned, is the insulin and glucagon that it works on. These really impact our appetite hormones that come from our stomach and signal up to our brain and tell our body, are we hungry, are we full, and when we should be eating. And that's one of the ways that they work on helping lower appetite. And so we can regulate these appetite hormones by improving blood sugar control, by eating every few hours in a way that is very balanced in those meals that we are consuming, and by getting adequate sleep every night. We know that sleep deprivation causes appetite hormones to go crazy, and you can wake up the next day and that you don't have as great a control over your appetite. So we want to make sure that we are really on top of our sleep to be able to help with this. Building lean muscle mass, our muscle is responsible for 70% of glucose disposal. So it's one of the biggest tools and weapons that we have for helping improve blood sugar control. And it's one of the biggest challenges that we face as we get older is that we constantly are losing lean muscle mass. So we want to make sure that we are doing exercise that helps stimulate our muscle mass. Resistance training is great for this. It could be maybe body weight to start, weights, dumbbells, whatever it might be. But we want to make sure that we are, if not building lean muscle mass, that we are stimulating muscle mass by resistance training and doing exercise at least a couple of times per week. There are some supplements that have been shown to also provide some of these benefits. These are things like berberine. Berberine it works very similar to the mechanisms of how metformin works, which is a different type of diabetes drug, in helping with activating something called AMPK. And because of that, it can also help with improving blood sugar control. Again, not everyone has a great response and people feel nauseated when they take it. So it's something that not everyone can utilize, but it can be a really great tool to help with blood sugar response as well. Mitochondrial support. Our mitochondria are a really important piece to insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is one of the ways that GLP-1s really help us lower that A1C and help to be able to improve blood sugar control. And when we are resistant to the hormone insulin, we want to resensitize our insulin receptors, and we can do that by incorporating things that support our mitochondria. And there's certain supplements that we can utilize. These are things like alpha lipoic acid, curcumin, certain B vitamins like B12, CoQ10. They're antioxidants and different vitamins that help to be able to support resensitization of our insulin receptors so that we can actually become more effective at utilizing that carbohydrate that we eat and getting that carbohydrate, that sugar, into the cells that need it. We also mentioned how these drugs work on delaying gastric emptying, which basically means that food is moving through your digestive system slower, which means that you stay full longer. And we can do the exact same thing by eating adequate fiber and fat when we eat meals. That's two ways that fiber and fat help keep us full, is that they also delay gastric emptying. Fiber is what we find in mainly vegetables, but we also get fiber in things like nuts and seeds, avocado, really anything that's sourced from a plant. So we want to make sure that we are eating a high fiber diet. And we're talking about natural sources of fiber, not fiber one bars and foods that have added fiber to them. Those aren't real fiber sources. They're man-made sources of fiber that are added to these processed foods. We want to really be utilizing natural fiber sources like what we get in the produce section. Fat, good healthy fats also help slow down gastric emptying and help keep us full longer. They help regulate these appetite hormones. These are things like avocado, nuts and seeds, olive oil, and even some of the fats that are in the animal proteins that we consume, such as you might have heard of omega-3 fatty acids, like what's found in salmon and sardines. Ensuring that we have some of these good fats paired with the fiber at these meals is also very helpful for keeping us full longer so that we don't have as great of appetite, and we can help regulate these appetite hormones. One of the other ways the GLP-1s work is by stimulating the nerve, or the vagus nerve, sorry. And the vagus nerve, it runs from our brain down to our gut. And there's quite a bit of research on the role of the vagus nerve in different digestive conditions, but also in helping with certain hormones and regulation of those. And when our vagus nerve is stimulated, it activates our parasympathetic state, so our body's rest and digest state. And we can actually activate this vagus nerve through things like gargling, humming, and singing. I know that sounds crazy, but these are ways that we can actually create some of this stimulation, and something you can do easily every day. And you can do this when you're brushing your teeth or after. You can gargle salt water. You can sing in the shower. You can sing when you're driving. But these all are great ways to be able to help stimulate this vagus nerve, which not only can help with the weight loss benefit, but also help with our digestive health. There's some research that yerba mate can promote release of GLP-1, so of this particular type of hormone that comes from our stomach. Yerba mate is a type of caffeinated beverage that I believe is sourced from South America, but it does have caffeine in it, so that is something to be careful with if you are caffeine sensitive. But it's an alternative option to coffee, and it can be utilized in place of coffee, in place of tea, to provide you caffeine, but also to simulate GLP-1, as the research has shown at least. We also know that anti-inflammatory nutrients are really important for stimulating GLP-1, and these are things like those omega-3 fatty acids that I mentioned, such as what you find in salmon, sardines, chia seeds, flax seeds, and also the curcuminoids, which are the active compound that's found in turmeric root. Most of the time, these are things that we supplement. You can, of course, eat these as well. But in order for us to achieve a high enough dose that's necessary to resolve inflammation and help with stimulation of GLP-1, we generally need to turn to supplementation, at least for meeting our basic needs. And so these are things that we can also recommend to you through our full script database, that would be beneficial for you to be able to provide some of these benefits. And then finally is boosting short chain fatty acids. Short chain fatty acids are something that are made in our colon, and they have tons of benefits for our digestive health, but they also have benefits to our appetite hormones, to blood sugar regulation, to insulin sensitivity. And there's even research that shows that short chain fatty acids also stimulate GLP-1. So we can actually boost our short chain fatty acids by eating fiber in general. So again, another win for eating a high fiber diet. And there are also supplements that we can use, such as something called butyrate, that can help to be able to boost this as well. And then we can also eat something that's called resistant starch. And this is a type of starch that forms when we cook and then cool certain starchy foods. So potatoes form resistant starch when they are cooked, then cooled. Green bananas are a form of resistant starch. And then we can also purchase potato starch. You might have seen that at the grocery store before. It's generally sold in the baking section. It's a unflavored powder. You add a tablespoon into a yogurt, a smoothie, whatever it might be. And that also is another great source of short chain fatty acids. So we have a lot of options, but across the board, we know short chain fatty acids are great for a lot of reasons. But now we are learning even more about the benefits that they have to GLP-1. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that this was informative. And Dr. Davis, I want to turn it back to you to see if you have any closing remarks to share with our patients.
First of all, thank you, Lauren, for sharing all of that wonderful information. There's a lot of ways that we could implement all sorts of lifestyle and nutritional choices in order to optimize our health. But yes, if anyone has any other questions or wants to discuss this further with myself or any of our registered dietitians, please call the office number and we can schedule an appointment.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.